Well, I'm delighted to welcome Reverend Dr. Tim Macquiban. What happened there? Tim Macquiban, who's Research Director at Englesea Brook Chapel and the Museum of Methodism. He's President Designate of the Wesley Historical Society and a member of the Archives and Records Advisory Group of the Methodist Heritage Committee. His areas of specialism are church history, Methodist history, and he also taught spirituality and liturgy when he was principal at Sarum College. He's going to explore the reception of and reaction to the Holiness movement within British Methodism in the 19th century and look at the way that Wesleyan and Primitive connections embraced or rejected features of the Holiness movement, looking particularly at camp meetings and revivalist meetings and the influence of Phoebe Palmer and others. So I'd like to welcome Tim. Please share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's good to be here. I looked with interest at the blurb on the introductory page of the programme, and it said this forum, this seminar exists for established and emerging scholars of Methodist studies. And I thought, well, which am I? Because I think I'm an emerging scholar, because I've emerged from a long hibernation from academic Methodist studies, having got diverted into ecumenical studies and ecumenical practice in the last, I guess, 15 years now. But I welcome this a chance to re-engage after a bit of an exile in Rome, but also a disclaimer, because time has not been on my side since coming back from retirement, not least the failure to unpack all my books, and therefore this title was given to me or suggested to me, and it isn't something I've done before, so in that sense it's not established work, it's work in progress, and I hope you will understand that. The blessed gift of venerating love, given to many humble craftsmen since the world began, a lingering afterglow from the time of Wesley in carrying a divine message to the poor. Who was that? Well, it was George Eliot in Adam Bede, 1859. We celebrated the 200th anniversary of her birth, aka Mary Ann Evans, just 2 weeks ago. She was a keen and critical observer in the middle years of the 19th century of the effects of the evangelical revivals of the Wesleys and then the second evangelical revival of the early 19th century as its legacy, not least in what she saw as the watering down and institutionalization of the initial fire of revival in clerical structures and attitudes. Weber, in a different context, has described such developments as the bureaucratization of charisma, which affected first of all the Wesleyan Methodists and then the Primitives and other branches who tried to keep warm the dying embers of revivalism. This paper will seek to examine the place of holiness teaching and practice within British Methodisms of the 19th century as they sought to keep alive or revive the doctrines of Christian perfection or scriptural holiness espoused by the Wesleys and John Fletcher in the earlier century. We shall describe the work of proponents and opponents of the holiness tradition and pose some questions as to why such tensions were exhibited. Because of my peculiar role now as Research Director of the Englesea Brook Chapel and Museum of Primitive Methodism, I'd like to give rather more weight to that strand within Methodism rather than that traditionally reserved for the Wesleyan branch. I also want to highlight the transatlantic nature of the developments in the 19th century and the North American influence on the religious trends of these nations, for good or ill, the legacies of which are still continuing to be felt, not least in the renaissance of Wesleyan holiness teaching and practice in the 20th and 21st centuries in different forms. It's therefore a particular delight to share in this conference to be able to reassess this topic in an interdisciplinary and interdenominational context. But an important caveat at this point: we can learn as much from contemporary literature and other forms of cultural expression of religious attitudes as we can from the writings of Methodists themselves. In that same novel, George Eliot writes, "Methodism may mean nothing more than low-pitched gables up dingy streets, sleek grocers, sponging preachers, and hypocritical jargon. elements which are regarded as an exhaustive analysis of Methodism in many fashionable quarters. I wondered why I'd been chosen to do this lecture. I wondered whether I was in a distinguished line of Timothys, Timothy Merritt right at the start to Timothy L. Smith in the 20th century, but I'm a Tim, and I want to bring something maybe slightly different to this topic on this occasion. I want to pay a debt to those who have helped me along my journey in Methodist history. David Bebbington, who was the first person to knock on my door at college, inviting me to kick you. Of course, he gave the Didsbury lectures here just 20 years ago. John Kent, my Methodist and MA supervisor at Bristol in Victorian church history. He encouraged me to hold the fort, and I hope to do so in this context too. Hugh MacLeod, my PhD supervisor in Birmingham, on Methodism and poverty, and that's an important aspect that I might well return to and develop in terms of wealth and poverty and the interrelationship with the Holiness movement. And then Donald Dayton and Ted Runyon, who participated in the Oxford Institutes of the 1970s, 80s and 90s on issues of sanctification, which were at the forefront, and the link with poverty. And last but not least, Christopher Evans of Colgate, Rochester, with whom I collaborated, and I think he was one of your lecturers here in recent years, on the social gospel, soup and salvation. But just a disclaimer, I'm not a historian of theology. I am a social and religious historian, interested in the social context of movements of revival and renewal. So let's first look at that 19th century context. David Bebbington reflects that perfection in love, holiness, was the jewel in the crown of the Wesleyan tradition in the 19th century, but it was not always static. We shall see that the deeply populist styles of holiness were resisted by the more conservative and cautious strands of Methodism. This was the cause, of course, of some leaving the connections and forming their own religious groups. Others chose to remain in, sometimes uneasily, and to belong to institutions or groupings within Methodism which put more emphasis on the doctrine of entire sanctification. Many of the holiness traditions which emerged from Methodism traced their theological roots to the Wesleyan movement of the 18th century, as they shared that same desire for a deeper experience of God, the high life, a growth in grace for full salvation, and that Christian perfection sealed with a baptism of the Spirit with fire. I hope I don't need to rehearse here the attempts of John Wesley and his preachers to reform the nation and spread scriptural holiness, which of course formed the bedrock of the Methodist movement, which became denominations and then churches. Donald Dayton has argued that the holiness movement was not so much a conservative throwback to earlier Methodism as a reappearance in a more radical form, particularly in the links that it made with issues related to gender and race, wealth and poverty. We might want to return to that in questions at the end. That there were tensions within Methodism was evident from the 18th century, tensions which were not merely theological, but also sociological, revolving around issues of ministry and mission. Hempton analyses the dialectical friction within Methodisms, especially the contrast between forms of discipline and sobriety and ecstasy and enthusiasm, between the voluntary acts of the free and the imposition of rules and regulations by clerical and lay autocracies structured along class and other lines. Reg Ward, examining the splits within British Methodism of the early 19th century, speaks of the contrast between, quote, the walled garden of the saints and the broader mission, no more obvious than in the Sunday schools. There was a fear nowhere better expressed than in the writings and rule of Jabez Bunting, of Methodistical Luddism, which was evident in the movements of revivalism, tinged with this more radical approach to holiness, as Methodism sought to reach out and then retreat from the main causes of estrangement from society and the working classes, namely, in his words, Jabez Bunting, radicalism, infidelity, and, may I mention it, socialism. In what Bebbington then described as the evangelical century, we need to be aware of these contrasts and nuances which may require us to question his judgment that evangelicals moulded British society in their own image, the so-called Victorian values, whilst recognising that forms of Methodism did indeed transform lives, if not society, through the use of women, challenging patriarchal hierarchies, and lay people with increasing education. Quote, "The Methodist spirit of pragmatic, aggressive evangelism was spreading beyond the bounds of Methodism, Bebbington, and a holiness which was both personal and social was a gift and charism to be shared with others." I choose as my time frame the period of Queen Victoria's reign up to the year 1904 with the establishment of Cliff College through the work of the three C's, Champness, Cook and Chadwick, and the height of the non-conformist conscience exemplified by the work of Hugh Price Hughes, beyond the influence of Methodism, social Christianity and the Holiness tradition, which became then contained within set boundaries. From Timothy Merritt's The Christian's Manual, a treatise on Christian perfection in 1837, and the further transatlantic influences of Oberlin theology and the altar theology of Phoebe Palmer, I'm not going to say much about that. Read Tim Woolley's recent paper to the Oxford Conference for more details. Alongside the revivalist preaching of James Caughey, which reached these shores in the 1840s, 50s, through to the higher life movement of the Pearsall Smiths and William Boardman in Oxford, Brighton and Keswick of the 1870s, and onwards to the campaigns of Moody and Sankey, through to the Forward movement and the Joyful News initiative, which spawned Cliff College from the 1880s onwards. I want to examine the reception of and response to the holiness teachings amongst the Wesleyans and Primitive Methodists in particular. The start of the period sees the severe reaction to exuberant forms of revivalism in Primitive Methodists and others, from Wesleyans still bearing the scars of Peterloo, we remembered recently in 1819. The association of camp meetings and all forms of revival with radicalism was social and political as well as religious. While the Primitive Methodists made significant gains at the expense of others in some years, they struggled hard to maintain connectional control through the pastoral office. To regain the momentum and to reach out to the unchurched masses was a perilous balancing act. Into this context come the transatlantic influences from the wider empire of the spirit, free from the social constraints of a homeland which had avoided the depths of political revolution to opt for piecemeal reforms from 1832 onwards. The influential formulations of the perfectionist teachings of Merritt, the Palmers and others opened up debates on the extent of holiness teaching which could be permitted within the strands of Methodism, and disputes as to the ways and means of incorporating a doctrine and practice of entire sanctification in the light of human experience and the readings of the Bible. Hempton judges that such matters, quote, troubled Methodism throughout its history and led inexorably to the separation of holiness movements from the main tradition in the second half of the 19th century. If the desire for entire sanctification has been one of the defining elements of Methodist spiritual energy, lack of consensus as to how it was to be delivered has proved to be one of its most divisive features. So first of all, the Wesleyan Methodists and then the Primitive Methodists. While many mainstream Methodist theologians of the 19th century acknowledged the place of entire sanctification within the corpus of works handed down from John Wesley and John Fletcher through Adam Clarke and Richard Watson, it did not play a prominent part in the thinking and preaching of many. Nevertheless, Christian perfection remained a hallowed part of the Methodist tradition and proved the basis for most of the 19th century holiness movement. It was a bestseller, running to 17 editions, that proved a catalyst for a revival of interest in the doctrine, when William Arthur, a prominent Irish Methodist who served British Methodism as its president and the leader of its missionary society, published his Tongue of Fire in 1856. The fiercely Protestant advocate of an aggressive mission to Italy and other Catholic countries saw holiness as a spur to mission and evangelism, in contrast to what were regarded as the forces of superstition. In this work, he tones down the idea of the second blessing and emptied entire sanctification of its radical edge. By the 1860s, the idea of a decisive second stage was at a low ebb. And in this 1874 conference of the Wesleyans, despite the enthusiasm of some younger ministers, the desire for a holiness organization within Wesleyan Methodism was rejected, in yet another instance of holiness enthusiasm being curbed. Or was it? There were younger ministers, J. Clapham Reeves, W.G. Pascoe, I.E. Page, and John Brash, who'd formed a group to promote scriptural holiness in the New Street Chapel of York in 1873. Such local initiatives, and there were others, could not necessarily be quenched by connectional interference by conference. The conference had, however, acted to try to limit what it saw as the unwanted evangelistic activities of Jane Cohey, attacked in the 1847 conference and forbidden to use Methodist premises, the result of Jabez Bunting's implacable opposition to him. Other denominations were not so coy in using the undoubted talents of this gifted Irish-American evangelist, and one Wesleyan minister went as far as defending him in print, in his Defended by a Wesleyan Leader in a Dialogue of the Whole Case of the Reverend James Cohey in Sheffield of that same year. Whilst the social respectability of those who espoused entire sanctification gained ground, the alliance of some of those with the growing cause of teetotalism earned them further opprobrium amongst Wesleyans who were only latterly converted to this bedrock of social expression of holiness amongst its own followers. The role of Cohey and the Palmers was to keep the holiness tradition alive in the Bunting decades, when it was most demoted and most opposed. And it was still strong in the 1860s when Cohey records his visit to Rochdale in 1861. At a Bailey Street gathering, he records 541 seekers, of whom 374 were justified and 157 sanctified. Of these, only a fifth were Wesleyans. Rochdale, which gave birth to the cooperative movement, also witnessed the birth of the Joyful News mission under Thomas Champness. The Joyful News was an official expression in the publication of that name and in the work of its evangelists in different districts and at home and overseas of holiness teaching. It built upon the pioneering work of Page and Brash in publishing The King's Highway from 1872 until 1900, a very important vehicle for the holiness movement within Methodism, and was echoed in the Classic Convention's own publication, The King's Pathway, which did not have such an effect within Methodism. Whilst the Wesleyans had rejected an official attempt to establish a holiness organisation internally, this did not prevent the establishment of a holiness convention at Southport in 1885 by W.H. Tyndall. Meeting annually, it attracted a wide range of sympathetically minded Methodists and some key preachers from within the connection, including the Reverend E.E. Jenkins, a successor to Arthur at the overseas missions. This built on the establishment of groups formed by those who were inspired by the 1874-1875 meetings in Oxford, Brighton and Keswick, by whom they did not wish necessarily to be part of what many Methodists regarded as the Anglican-dominated, Calvinist-impregnated holiness teaching of a more transcendental type, not earthed with Wesleyan pragmatism. The opposition of Bishop Lyle of Liverpool to these developments confirmed the suspicions of many Wesleyan Methodists. The espousal of holiness teaching by Thomas Champness and the decision of conference to set him aside as a connectional evangelist marked a change of mood, to put the more efforts into urban and rural missions through the use of lay evangelists and other officers alongside ministerial colleagues. What Hugh Price Hughes did in London, in West London Mission and at other places, Champness did in other places as a reaction to the seeming negligence of the Wesleyans, wedded to the mahogany and bays of their plush suburban chapels, having abandoned the city centres and villages in the middle years of the century. This was perhaps also a reaction to the establishment of a holiness movement born out of Methodism in the form of what became the Salvation Army, the work of William and Catherine Booth. We shall hear more of that this afternoon. Once the role of laypersons in the Wesleyan Conference became recognised and the role of women within missions became accepted, then other features, I would argue, of holiness teaching-inspired ministries could more readily be accepted by Wesleyan Methodists. The hostile attitudes which had led Henry Breeden, a Wesleyan lay evangelist in Derby, who became the first general superintendent of the breakaway Arminian Methodists in 1832, to separate no longer pertained, though suspicions remained, of those associated with Wesleyan holiness teaching. When did this change occur? Perhaps a pivotal point was in the 1886 year, with the appointment of Thomas Cook as connectional evangelist and the establishment of the Joyful News Convention headed up by Thomas Champness. The formation of a company of evangelists under the Joyful News mission in the previous year was heralded thus, Champness's daughter's words, "Let it be a beginning, a day of hope for Methodism." That decade saw the beginnings of reactions against the watered-down versions of holiness teaching and full-frontal attacks on the way in which Wesleyan Methodism had lost its way, yielding to the pressures of rising respectability, which had toned down the official teaching on the subject. That's David Bebbington. The advent of Hugh Price Hughes, a giant of the late 19th century Methodist involvement in British society, his passionate desire to show the relevance of Christianity to the social problems of the age, brought the tenets of holiness teaching into a crusade for moral purity and social reformation, hitherto unknown on the national stage, and made the work of holiness enthusiasts respectable and potentially rewarding for individual and church growth. So we turn to the Primitive Methodists. The Methodists who were converted in the ways of revivalism in the first 2 decades of the century adopted the name of Primitive, claiming Wesleyan origins for the term used by the founder in my home city of Chester just before he died. Camp meeting Methodists might have gone the way of the later tent Methodists established just 200 years ago, but it was the camp meetings which survived as the engine of revival and provided the model for the holiness gatherings later in the century. With this exception, however, the early Primitive Methodist camp meetings were held outside in all weathers, while the later holiness conventions in Britain retreated to mainly large public areas and spaces under cover and indoors. Another mark of respectability. Owen Chadwick's magisterial, if not faintly patronising judgment on the reception of Wesley's doctrine of entire sanctification was that, quote, some Primitive Methodist preachers press not only instantaneous conversion, but instantaneous holiness upon their simple people. Early preachers like John Petty and Johnny Praying Oxtoby testified to entire sanctification as part of their spiritual development. Entire sanctification was both progressive and instantaneous in their preaching and practice. The memory of the fiery revivalist preaching of William Bramall in Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, who preached with his female assistant Anne Cutler a present and full salvation, and taught through the exercise of faith in bringing what some call burning love, a warm, glowing feeling in the heart. Some of his converts left the less than warmed Wesleyan connection and joined the Primitive Methodists in the early days. A full, free and present salvation became a catchphrase for later Primitive Methodism. But Hugh Bourne, its co-founder, whilst welcoming the results of such exuberant preaching, expressed caution in using the doctrine in sermons, stressing rather the ongoing quest for holiness. There was a decline in the sanctification-orientated revivalist spirit of Primitive Methodism of the 1820s, as it too, the Primitive Methodist connection became more connectional and less mission-focused in what license characterizes as moving from revivalism to recreation, a word you shouldn't use unless advisedly. There was a different emphasis after 1850, possibly in reflections on the work of William Arthur, who was a great influence in reviving interest in holiness. Leading the field for the Primitive Methodists in this was Abraham Worsnop, whose entire sanctification, distinct from justification and attainable before death, went into a third edition by 1872, drawing heavily on Wesley and Clarke. He wrote this work as a companion to his Scripture Questions for Bible classes, an indication perhaps of how and where holiness teaching was most likely to be transmitted in classes, small groups. The reviewer of this work wrote in the Primitive Methodist magazine in 1859, "On the subject of entire sanctification, there is, as may be expected, from the diversity in human minds, the influence of education, the power of prejudice, etc., etc., a considerable diversity of sentiment amongst those who believe in this doctrine, a doctrine which can never be overthrown while the truth of God remains. It is a truth," that's in bold capitals, "a truth if we walk with the Lord. And we ask, is it not equally true that we may be filled with all the fullness of God?" That's in the Connectional magazine. He goes on to make the case for this being an authentically Wesleyan approach, drawing on the records of divine truth. In the review in the magazine, the book is commended as a useful manual which deserves the writer's best wishes to promote what is essential to the true dignity of the Church and the purity of her members. The 1860s sees a flurry of interest in holiness writing reported in those magazines. An interesting article in 1866 by one of its ministers, Mark Graves, who was an agricultural labourer and local preacher before he becomes an itinerant minister in 1862. In his article, he pulls no punches in putting before his readers what he considers the greatest need of the Church. What is that greatest need? Of complete consecration. It is for want of complete consecration that her efforts are so puny, that she makes so little advancement. The Church, he argues, needs a larger baptism of the Spirit. Unless they are born again, they invoke the names of Wesley and Fletcher and William Clowes in vain, pointing it, in his view, to the emphasis on wealth, that's building chapels, and missions, that's aggressively getting ahead of your neighbours, and revivals, perhaps camp meetings, as costly diversions, if not founded on complete consecration. He goes on, if the Church were fully consecrated, what a work would she accomplish for souls and for God? What millions would be saved? And our hearts, our talents, our property, our words and actions must be written, holiness unto the Lord. Entire sanctification is entire holiness. His heroes of the faith that he quotes, Bramwell, Clowes, Oxtoby and Smith, were all men distinguished for their holiness. Descending into a holy rant worthy only of a primitive Methodist, he concludes, in an age of public houses increasing, Sabbath desecration and light, trashy and infidel literature flooding the land and poisoning the minds of thousands, oh, then to counteract these evils, defeat the devil and bring the world to Christ, let there be entire consecration. Then the entire Church would be ready for prayer, benevolence and labour, and all the world would unite in one glorious anthem, Hallelujah, the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. The storms are upon us. the showers of blessings, whether it's a second blessing or whatever, I don't. I would like to have said that as a result, many were convinced by his arguments. It is difficult to know, of course, but this sounds to be the voice of one crying in the wilderness, as the records show that in that same year, he ended his itinerancy of 5 years in 4 different stations in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. He returned to becoming a lay member in his hometown of Selby as a linen grocer and auctioneer. Perhaps his words had fallen on deaf ears. Yet interest remained in the Primitive Methodist magazines in the form of a series of articles on holiness by another minister, Alfred Clayton, serving in Loughborough, who concludes that you'll want this lecture to go on and on and on now, won't you? Because you don't really want to get out there and get soaked. Alfred Clayton, serving in Loughborough, who concludes that holiness is a complete blessing. It is entire. It is the destruction of all sin, outward and inward. He argues for the doctrine as complete and instantaneously, and at any time rather than progressive. His brand of primitive theology, Methodist theology offers a present, full and free salvation. His obituary records that he held a lofty ideal of the Christian life, which does rather imply that his contemporaries probably didn't share his zeal for holiness. Further articles appear with increasing regularity in the 1870s on personal holiness, in 1873, personal consecration, 1874, the latter written by the connectional editor, who lashes out at his fellow Christians. There was, he said, an alarming conformity of professed Christians to the luxurious refinements of modern society, which implies a retrogression from that heightened spirituality which was conspicuous in many of our Christian predecessors. In the spread of popery and its baby offspring Anglican ritualism, in the advance of infidelity which is patronized and inculcated largely by the educated and is percolating through the various strata of society, and already is intensively spread in the great centres of industry and population amongst the working classes. They discover ominous indications of a threatened retribution for spiritual declension, the result of a lifeless Christianity and intellectual contempt for an irrational formalism. It behoves us to make our religion a living reality. The answer is for believers to be, quote, realized in the higher life of Christ. At the beginning of the new year, he urged all Primitive Methodists to make this year a year for personal consecration. And that's 1874, significantly. And it's the year, of course, of those great meetings. Lest we fall into the trap of assuming a wave of holiness teaching swept the churches, there is, by way of balance, an article in that same volume, that same year, by the Reverend David Steele, warning readers of the dangers of a fanaticism exhibited by those who, quote, run mad on the subject of holiness. Such fanatical pretenders to Christian perfection as Wesley himself encountered in Maxfield and others are still to be found in Primitive Methodism and beyond in the later 19th century. He says, in view of the possibility of such an unlovely character coming into existence under the preaching of entire sanctification, would it not be wise to abstain from inculcating this high doctrine, lying as it does on the borders of an infatuation so dangerous? Well, this may well have been a result of the impending publication of Asa Mahan's Christian Perfection, with an introduction by the Reverend George Warner, who is perhaps the greatest holiness influence in Primitive Methodism in the late 19th century. George Warner converted in 1848 in a Wesleyan chapel at Worcester, and when he moved back to his home area, he joined the Primitive Methodists at Napton. He was soon on the plan and called to ministry by the Bamboo Circuit in 1851. A hint of George's style comes through the description of his work at Malmesbury in Kendall's great work. As late as 1854, Malmesbury at last yielded to the vigorous assaults of George Warner, and in 1858 was made a circuit. Warner was the first entirely connectionally supported evangelist, a benefactor named T. Jones having given £100 to inaugurate his career as a holiness evangelist. George Warner had a vision to unite the call to salvation with the challenge of holiness. speaking of the relationship of faith to full salvation, George said, believe me, it's true, "It is like a man under a shower bath. He pulls down the chain and down comes the water." You see, prophetic words. In his introduction to Mahan's Christian Perfection, he wrote that he'd read it every year since he first acquired a copy, presumably an American imprint, 20 years earlier in 1855. He commended it as the most comprehensive work, setting forth the scriptural character of this great grace. He points out that many had been brought into a full enjoyment of full salvation in the earlier part of the Methodist revival. So what was needed? What was needed was holiness. Holiness repaired. Holiness offered. Holiness attainable. Holiness a present duty, a present privilege, a present enjoyment. Those were the outlines of no doubt, the lecture that he gave on the subject. He urged the progress and completeness of its wondrous theme. That the book appeared on the Primitive Methodist bookstore list in conjunction with the National Publishing Association for the Promotion of Holiness, along with the books of Pearsall Smith and Boardman, indicates that the Primitive Methodists were being willingly and officially introduced to holiness teaching in the 1870s. His contemporary Thomas Waugh was typical in denouncing questionable amusements such as gambling and dancing. A spirit-filled church, as he put it, is world emptied. The principle of avoiding popular forms of entertainment was widespread in evangelicalism as a whole, but holiness zealots could apply it particularly sternly. George Warner, the leading holiness preacher amongst the Primitive Methodists, always regarded simple musical services as dangerous, in the same way as Wesleyans regarded Moody and Sankey gatherings. Perhaps the most challenging of the campaigns against worldliness was the one against, yes, you thought it was going to be drink, didn't you? But no, smoking. The King's Highway carried in 1882 an article from its American counterpart urging the abandonment of tobacco. Warner frequently denounced its use. The tobacco habit and appetite were alike inconsistent with holiness, he insisted. He himself had renounced the habit and God had destroyed his appetite. In several of Warner's missions, smokers abandoned their pipes. They came forward from the back, one local preacher giving it up during the singing of "My All is on the Altar." And so it went. On the table went the pipe. Sir Henry Thompson performed surgery on George Warner and remarked on the state of his knees. George told him that night after night he was on his knees in prayer and reading the scriptures, and that had produced a particularly painful problem. After he superannuated in 1891, George continued to work as a special agent in Nottingham and Bristol and Settle, where he died. A biography was subsequently published, written by J. Stevenson, entitled "The Man of Faith and Fire, or the Life and Work of Reverend G. Warner." And it paid tribute to the one who had stemmed the decline in the holiness tradition, which he judged was in severe decay in the 1860s within the Methodist tradition, with Primitive Methodist ministers preaching against that Methodist doctrine of entire sanctification. The Reverend I.E. Page, one of those holiness enthusiasts from the Wesleyan tradition, he was a typical Primitive Methodist, a fervid, happy saint with glory in his soul. He had a passion for saving men and for leading believers into Christ's full salvation, and God used him to save many. Under his preaching and in one of his missions, Gypsy Smith in 1878 was converted. Conclusion. Holiness by faith in Jesus, not by effort of thine own, sin's dominion crushed and broken by the power of grace alone. God's own holiness within thee, his own beauty on thy brow, this shall be thy pilgrim brightness, this thy blessed portion now. I saw some nods to those who know who the hymn writer was. It's the hymn of Francis Ridley Havergal, at the conclusion printed of the Christian Holiness Convention held in Bradford in 1889, bringing together Christians of different traditions, seeking, quote, a deepening of spiritual life, which distinctly vindicates the oneness of the Church of Christ and the blessed unity of the Spirit of God, through whom believers become united as branches of the same vine. And yet, as I looked at the list of the speakers, none of the speakers came from those Methodist branches who seemingly were unable to themselves to join together in this new spirit of ecumenism. Another 40 years, you remember, were to elapse before such Methodist unity could be displayed in a united church. Holiness was not the glue to bring the divided parts of Methodism together just yet. In retrospect, it seems that though the Primitive Methodists were more likely to be a holiness people, and the Wesleyans more ambivalent to this aspect of Wesleyan legacy, it was the Wesleyans who stole the emperor's clothes at the end of the 19th century. As Hempton reminds us, sanctification was no respecter of gender or race, but in the British context he might have added, and class. Bebbington argues that the holiness emphasis was more likely to be received by the lower classes, though the Keswick movement, as we heard earlier, does rather undermine that in terms of the social mobility of those who are attended. Scriptural holiness becomes the concern of a limited and relatively proletarian sector within 20th century Methodism. Well, that was one of the open questions at the end of my initial research in this area, which I think deserves more research, and maybe others have done it that I'm just not aware of. Maybe even research needed into the background of those recruited to Cliff College, and whether they stayed within Methodism or moved to serve other churches. A very fruitful area, I think. The decline of the class meeting in Methodism is indicative, I would argue, that the fire had gone out of the revivalist elements of both the Wesleyans and the Primitives, though there were attempts to recover this tradition and practice. But the espousal of holiness teaching, alongside the renewal of home missions in gospel cars, touring the villages, spreading the good news, as well as in the Central Hall building programme of the last 2 decades of the Victorian era, meant that this was not all lost to those who more vigorously expressed this in their preaching and practice, notably the Salvation Army. Methodism was poorly represented in the elite of the holiness movement, which was hijacked by the Anglicans, as Methodism aligned itself more with the Free Church movement and put more emotional energy into, dare I say it, self-preservation rather than a commitment to ecumenism, except perhaps in missions, as evidenced by the Edinburgh Conference of 1910. Throwing itself behind the crusade to reform the nation, led by Hugh Price Hughes, in that moral purity aspect born out of the holiness teaching. Perhaps this was a reaction to those Methodists who had, quote, drunk of the Oberlin well and found the parlour perfectionism of fellow Methodists such as Phoebe Palmer sentimental and lacking in ethical vigour. That's in the introduction to the dictionary on the holiness movement, Costlevy. Did, as Thompson posits, the moral fervour of nonconformity, underpinned by this holiness emphasis, smack too much of self-righteousness and hypocrisy, as Eliot too had observed with the eye of the novelist? Or was it the basis for a renewal of both evangelicalism and Pentecostalism in the 20th century, polarised around those for and against the social gospel, which had gained momentum in the first 2 decades of the 20th century? Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much for that. I suspect there are probably many questions to come. We do have some time for questions, so would anybody like to start us off? Yes.
It's probably unfair, Tim, because you've covered 2 whole sections of Methodism, leaving only one yet to cover. But I was struck by the fact that that event you described, with 500 people actually in Rochdale, was at Bailey Street,
Yes.
which was a free Methodist chapel.
Yes, yes.
And developed in subsequent years.
Yes, the doors were
strong independence. Was that simply that they'd booked the biggest chapel, or was it a sign of an acceptance within the United Methodist Free Church?
I think there was more of an acceptance outside the Wesleyan and primitive traditions to such events and rallies and revivalist meetings than there was within those two. So I think, yes, in terms of MNC and indeed others, there was that, and particularly the Free Methodists, yes. Yeah. Yes, we're just coming out of the Wesleyan reformers and all that, the fly sheets controversy. So I think, you know, the Wesleyans were fearful, but then they recovered, I think, in the 1880s and saw it not as a threat, but as an imperative and an opportunity to get re-engaged with missions, with this holiness teaching as something which would help them in that.
Thank you. Bill.
Tim, coming back to your sort of prospectus at the beginning about the character of holiness,
Yeah.
is it too much of a stretch to argue that what fundamentally you're arguing is that theologically it is progressive and radical, but socially it is conservative and potentially even more than conservative, it is regressive?
I think there are inevitably tensions within the movement, and I think that precisely highlights those tensions between the radical and conservative elements, which might be expressed theologically or they might be expressed socially, and within the different traditions there would be a different emphasis and balance with those. But I think we live with a mixed legacy of what that teaching was from Wesley himself. And as you said, you know, the argument goes on as to what the place of that doctrine of entire sanctification was in the very earliest beginnings, let alone its outworkings within Fletcher and others later.
Have another?
They want lunch.
Well, I was going to say, unless there's anybody else. I was going to say, Tim, thank you very much for that. So.